Welcome everyone to a special meeting of the International Security Speaker Series. What we're going to be talking about today and what our guests will be speaking about is a topic and a word that a lot of us throw around, a lot of us talk around quite a bit, and that's globalization. Globalization, as you know, is the word of the day. You probably encounter it in a lot of your classes. It's something we hear on TV, something that we read about in articles and newspapers. Yet we still puzzle and struggle over what it is, what are its origins, what are its consequences, what is the import of it. One could actually argue that globalization has been with us for quite a long time. That Europe, for example, was more globalized in July of 1914 than it is even now. So it's a word that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. But the globalization that we're concerned with today, the one that affects our lives, certainly had an origin. And our speaker today is going to look at that origin in what I think many people would think of as a forgotten decade, the 1970s, a decade that's typically associated with malaise, decline, any number of problems. But for the historian who's with us today, Daniel Sargent, that decade actually had within it the seeds of change, the seeds of transformation that gave us the international globalized system that we have today. And Daniel Sargent is here to speak to us about this. Daniel comes to us from Harvard, where he is currently completing his PhD in the Department of History. Has about one of the most distinguished dissertation committees one can imagine. Niels Ferguson, Ernie May, Charlie Meyer. And he is working on a dissertation called From Internationalism to Globalism, the United States and the Transformation of International Politics, 1965 to 1980. And the bits of this I've seen and read about and heard about, Daniel is essentially looking at how the Cold War system, the containment system, both on the economic, security, normative side, transformed itself to what we now know is a completely different world, and how this happened in the 1970s. It promises to be an extraordinarily ambitious endeavor, but also a very exciting one. Now, this, as I've mentioned, is a very unique talk, and it's unique more than anything else because of the people who have put it together. The talk is sponsored by 3 different groups, and I want to sort of thank them all. Leading this is the Department of History, and I want to give special thanks to their chair, Alan Tully, and to Mark Lawrence, who's traveled all the way from New Haven, who's on leave this year, or actually for 2 years, which we're missing him very much, but we're very happy that he came back for this special occasion. And I think this is indicative of our hope, both at the LBJ School and at the Strauss Center, that we will be doing more things with the History Department and with Alan and with Mark. The second sponsor is the Strauss Center, Robert F. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and I want to thank my colleagues for helping putting this on, and also the LBJ School. So this is a unique collaboration, and hopefully the first of many. So Daniel will talk for 35, 40 minutes.
That's right.
And then we'll open it up to questions. And if anyone hasn't seen it, there's some pizza in the background for anyone who's hungry. So if you could join me in welcoming Daniel to Austin.
Well, thank you, Frank, for the introduction. 1968 was a tumultuous year in American politics. With troops mired in a divisive war in Southeast Asia, the economy struggling to produce both guns and butter, and domestic politics increasingly resembling the opening phase of a civil war, the future for the United States as a leader among nations appeared precarious. A common view was that the late 1960s marked the end of an era for American power. Henry Kissinger talked about the passage of the post-war era of international relations. Richard Nixon believed that his citizens had simply lost their appetite for leadership, that they were turning away from the world to focus instead upon domestic problems. Nixon worried that the United States had become a reluctant giant, tired of using its physical power and seeking peace and reconciliation almost feverishly. Preoccupied by this decline, the president ranged his foreign policy as a lonely struggle against retreat. In my view, What Nixon, Kissinger, and so many of their contemporaries were reaching to describe was the twilight of an era of American ascendancy that had existed within the divided world known as the Cold War. As I approached this problem, this era, it raised difficult questions. What were the sources of this crisis in American power that occurred during the 1970s? How did it affect specific foreign policy choices? And most importantly, how did the United States recover to sustain its superpower role over the long term? These are the central questions that inform my work on American foreign policy in the 1970s. Indeed, it was the very failure of those prophets of decline who spoke in the late 1960s that drew my attention to this period in the first place. I became intrigued to understand why the United States did not retreat from the world as so many had prophesied and feared, but was instead able to establish a new era of ascendancy, one that would ultimately transcend the Cold War itself. The more that I reflected on it, I began to see that the system of leadership that emerged from this crisis of the 1970s was, in important respects, quite different from what had existed before. The handout that you have in front of you identifies some of the key differences, as I see them, between these two systems of American leadership. I won't go through the table on a row-by-row basis, but I will suggest that by the 1980s, the patterns of American engagement with the world had changed quite dramatically. In this new era, American leadership came to depend less upon the brute power of the American state and more upon the mastery of private economic and transnational ideological resources. The central question that I address in my dissertation has to do with the transition. How did the United States get from there to here? As I struggled to devise an answer to this question, I became convinced of the need for new perspectives on the international history of the 1970s. According to the classic historiographical outlook, the 70s were remarkable primarily as a lull in the Cold War, an interlude of superpower symmetry and forced congeniality. In other words, the 70s were the fleeting era of détente that endured only until Ronald Reagan reignited East-West hostilities in the 1980s. But as I explored the reams of primary sources that have only recently become available, it became obvious to me that there was much going on in the world besides the renegotiation of the Cold War. As I worked to make sense of the period, I came to depend more and more on those contemporaries who described a new condition of interdependence among the nations of the Western world. For these observers, the world in the 1970s was experiencing a tectonic shift in its international relations. The manifestations of these changes associated with interdependence ranged from the ascent of multinational corporations to environmental degradation and even international terrorism. These changes, as so many observers saw it, cumulatively threatened to erode the autonomy of the sovereign state in world affairs. Those changes that contemporaries described as the advent of interdependence seemed to me to represent a new phase in the long historical process of globalization. If we define globalization as a phenomenon encompassing both the intensification of social and economic connections across national borders and also the increased influence of transnational actors in the world, then the 70s were a critical threshold in its development. But to really get at this transformation, it became necessary for me to embrace an alternative concept of international history, one quite different from diplomatic history in its concerns and priorities. Fortunately, I was able to learn much from the proponents of a new global history, such as Bruce Maslish and Akira Iri, who argue that we should conceive of a global realm of non-state forces and actors alongside the diplomatic realm of nation-states and their interactions. As I reflected on it, I came to the conclusion that the 1970s was a critical phase in the entwinement between these two realms of international history. The 70s were the threshold through which global actors came to exert a new degree of influence on the behavior and choices of nation-states. But this did not mean the end of diplomatic history. Instead, it is by straddling these two conceptions of the past, the geopolitical and the global, that I have developed the central argument of my dissertation. This is that the onset of a new mode of globalization in the 1970s was intimately related to both the crisis of American power in the world of the Cold War and to the emergence of a new system of American leadership thereafter. What I will try to do in this talk is to give you some sense of this broader argument through an examination of three themes. First, I will talk about the system of American ascendancy that existed during the High Cold War and endured, I argue, until around the late 1960s. I will explain how this system began to fragment, both because of the contradictions of nuclear weapons and because of the destructive impact of external globalization. I will then narrow my focus for my second theme, which explores the impact of financial globalization on American leadership. Then for my third theme, I will discuss the ways in which ideas about human rights, a kind of ideological globalization, intruded on the United States structure of international power and contributed to the long-term recasting of American leadership in the world. Through each of these themes, I will emphasize the connections between the two conceptual realms of international history, the global and the diplomatic. By describing the ways in which the international system of the 1970s changed in response to social, economic, and technological forces, as well as in responses to tangible decisions by national actors, I hope to reveal why the 70s were both a phase of crisis and of recasting for American leadership in the world. Let us begin with the theme of power. Our starting point should be the Second World War. As has long been familiar to historians, Franklin Roosevelt approached this conflict as an opportunity to cast the world anew, but the breakdown of the wartime Grand Alliance sharply limited the scope of his universalizing ambitions. Consequently, the most important institutional structure of the post-war era was not prefabricated according to wartime design. It was instead hastily improvised. This was the security system whereby the United States marshaled the strength of the Western world against the Soviet Union. The basic objectives of America's strategy of containment in the Cold War are well known. Besides strengthening the West, it sought to restrain Soviet aggression through the control of territorial space and through the application of countervailing force. This was a prudent response to the challenge of Soviet power, even as it was a retreat from Roosevelt's more universal visions of international order. Within the Western Alliance, American leadership did emphasize economic and cultural attachments, but it depended on nothing else so much as U.S. mastery of nuclear weapons. The unfolding of America's nuclear umbrella was an integrative process within a divided world. It opened up space and it eroded barriers. But it was also an incremental process. It was not until the late 1950s that the Europeans finally agreed to forswear their own nuclear weapons and to depend upon the deterrent power of the American arsenal. It was only in the 1960s that the war system became truly transnational in the sense that the entire globe had become utterly vulnerable to the apocalyptic power of nuclear weapons. These weapons obliterated classic conceptions of territorial sovereignty, even as they enhanced the transnational authority of the two superpowers. But at the same time, it is essential to remember that their impact on international relations was mostly theoretical. In more tangible respects, as I will argue, the world during the High Cold War remained sharply divided into a patchwork of territorial jurisdictions. Nuclear weapons unshackled the historical relationship between security and territory, but in other respects, nation-states remained the basic building blocks of world politics and of America's Cold War alliance. But by the late 1960s, the expansion of American strategic power had reached its irresistible limits when it ran up against the countervailing force of Soviet nuclear arms, as this chart illustrates. What now existed was not so much an arms race as a stalemate. After 1969, the Nixon administration worked with the Soviet Union to establish quantitative limits on offensive nuclear weapons and to establish an agreement to restrain the two powers from deploying anti-ballistic missile systems. These agreements, consecrated in 1972, established deterrence as a stable condition of international relations. Their political counterpart came with the Helsinki Accord of 1975, an agreement that had the effect of ratifying the territorial status quo in Europe. With these agreements, the Cold War ceased to be a dynamic competition. It became a stable configuration of international power. For Nixon and Kissinger, this stabilization was the key to their entire strategic agenda, which was to sustain American leadership in the world. Their grand strategy sought to sustain American leadership by reinvigorating national power, by rejuvenating the Cold War alliance structure, and ultimately by dividing the adversary's forces. Their failure, ultimately, to achieve this revitalization can, I believe, be explained in terms of the corrosive impact of a new type of globalization upon the ossified structure of Cold War international politics. It is to this process of transformative globalization that I will now turn with my next two themes. I'll begin with the second theme of money. One of the arguments that I develop in my dissertation is that from the late 1960s, the globalization of financial markets destabilized Bretton Woods, which was the institutional framework for the post-war economic miracle. This is not in itself a controversial point, but what I hope that I can bring to the table is a new kind of emphasis on the connections between economic globalization and the transformation of American political influence in the 1970s. I'd like to characterize Bretton Woods as representing a political economy of containment in two senses of the word. The first of these is that Bretton Woods served the overarching objective of anti-Soviet containment by organizing the strength of the Western world under American leadership. At the same time, the system embodied a quite different sense of containment, one that had to do with restraining the excesses of global capitalism rather than the Red Army. The essence of this mode of containment, as economists like Morris Obstfeld have shown, was that Bretton Woods allowed governments to restrict the movement of money across borders. The system's architects believed this to be necessary in order for governments to manage their own economic space in pursuit of domestic welfare objectives. This prioritization of domestic objectives over global openness was a legacy of the Great Depression. It also derived inspiration from Keynes' general theory, the foundational text of modern macroeconomics. As the dominant power in the West, the United States endorsed these basic economic precepts. Fearing the appeal of European communism in times of hardship, Washington encouraged its allies to target domestic welfare objectives. Even within the United States, the period of the High Cold War saw the triumph of national economics, an outlook exemplified by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. As an economic system, Bretton Woods restrained transnational money flows in the name of anti-communism. In other words, it worked to confine capitalism within a political framework. It was only from the late 1960s that an unplanned resurgence of global finance began to erode both the stability of Bretton Woods and the United States' hegemonic role within the system. The reasons why Bretton Woods became vulnerable to the pressures of global finance are rather complicated. I will not go too deep into the technical details here, but the basic outline of the problem is illustrated by this chart. What this chart shows is total U.S. reserves against dollar liabilities, indicated respectively by the yellow and the green lines. As you can see, the United States exported dollars through the 1950s and 1960s, many of them going to pay for U.S. military commitments overseas. What had developed by 1965, the point at which the two lines intersect, was a dollar overhang whereby the United States owed more money to foreigners than it held gold reserves in Fort Knox. This was a precarious situation because if foreign dollar holders decided en masse to demand conversion of their paper dollars into gold, the entire system would have collapsed. As Frank has shown in his work, the United States was, for the time being, able to persuade most of its allies to hold on to most of their dollars, thereby sustaining an increasingly overvalued currency. But as the decade progressed, the fate of the dollar came to depend increasingly not on foreign governments, but rather on the whims of private money holders. Now, what you can see in this second chart is the early phase of a process that has since become known as financial globalization. The euro markets were an extraterritorial market for dollars that existed outside of the United States, primarily in London. Unregulated by any government, this market was the forerunner of today's integrated global capital market. The euro market grew rapidly in the late 1960s. Its depositors avoided legal restrictions and received excellent rates of interest in return. By the early 1970s, the value of euro-dollar deposits amounted to over a quarter of the entire American money supply. The existence of these mobile funds rendered Bretton Woods increasingly unstable because if euro-dollar holders decided to desert the currency, they would surely have triggered a broader dollar crisis. In this way, the stability of the money system came to depend increasingly on private money holders who, thanks to the innovative euro markets, were no longer restrained by legal restrictions on short-term capital movements. But what is not always well understood is that the United States had itself become far more dependent on these transnational money markets than many observers realized. After 1968, borrowing from the euro markets became the main factor keeping the American balance of payments afloat. With interest rates relatively high, the U.S. received a torrent of money worth billions of dollars in 1969 and 1970, and we can see this influx on the chart as the decline in dollar liabilities after 1968. These money flows, which came primarily from the euro markets, sustained America's overall balance of payments with the external world. But like Germany in the 1920s, the United States had become dangerously dependent on flows of short-term capital that could be reversed if they would find better prospects elsewhere. In mid-1970, Richard Nixon inadvertently precipitated the dollar crisis when he ordered the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates. Investors responded by shifting their holdings out of the dollar and into other currencies, especially the Deutschmark. The correlation between short-term money flows, shown in the red line, and the interest rate is striking during this period. By the spring of 1971, U.S. officials were describing a tidal wave of money fleeing the dollar. The crisis had arrived, and it was, in no small measure, a consequence of the euro markets. From the Bundesbank, Ottmar Emminger complained that the transnational money market had made it impossible for Germany to control the influx of dollars. In August, Nixon repudiated the United States' commitment to convert dollars for gold. Many scholars have described this as the formal end of Bretton Woods, yet we have not always acknowledged the extent to which this crisis was the product of incipient financial globalization. The ultimate collapse of Bretton Woods played out slowly over the next 18 months as policymakers accommodated themselves to the new world of capital mobility. At first, Nixon used the crisis as an opportunity to devalue the dollar, a move that he hoped would improve a dwindling trade balance. But even this recalibration of exchange rates could not satisfy private money holders who continued to believe that the dollar was grossly overvalued. In early 1973, it fell victim to a renewed crisis of confidence on the money markets. At this point, now Secretary of the Treasury George Shultz proposed doing away with fixed exchange rates altogether, a move that would make currency prices far more responsive to market forces. When the second dollar crisis exploded at the beginning of 1973, the U.S. left its allies with little alternative but to accept Schultz's reform program, even though many European governments would have preferred to have maintained both fixed exchange rates and multilateral surveillance of the money markets. The second dollar crisis thus brought about the death of Bretton Woods, a collapse that began to unleash global capitalism from the matrix of controls that had characterized the post-war economic order from its inception. We do not customarily think about the end of Bretton Woods as a Cold War crisis, but it nonetheless had significant ramifications for the Cold War, some of which I would like to outline. In the short term, the dollar crisis threatened America's military commitments overseas. Indeed, Nixon's entire defense outlook was shaped by fiscal pressures. The Nixon Doctrine aimed to sustain the Cold War by forcing foreign governments to take on more of the financial burden of their own defenses. The dollar's freefall also exacerbated domestic concerns over the cost of the Cold War, as many Democrats began to ask whether it was really worth the expense after all. Financial globalization did not create these doubts about the cost of the Cold War, but it pushed the question to the fore. The crisis of Bretton Woods also strained relations between the United States and its European allies, who were alienated by American negotiating behavior in the moment of crisis. This was thus an important step in the breakdown of the Cold War alliance into a looser grouping of powers, no longer so purposefully united as before. If globalization inflamed a crisis of American power in the early 1970s, subsequent developments confirmed both its trajectory and its disruptive impact on international relations. In retrospect, it is easy to think about this process of financial globalization as if it had somehow been foreordained or inevitable. But new primary sources, especially records of intergovernmental negotiations, suggest that financial globalization was really quite contingent on contemporary choices. Had the United States cooperated more effectively with its allies, Bretton Woods might have lasted at least a few years longer. Then, in 1973, came the oil crisis and a wave of payment surpluses for the oil exporters. Unable to spend all of their dollar revenues on Fifth Avenue real estate, luxury automobiles, and infrastructural projects, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Emirates plowed billions of dollars back into the euro markets, from which Western nations could now borrow to finance their oil imports. Petrodollar recycling thus confirmed a logic of financial globalization. Yet even this crisis could have been managed so as to have enhanced multilateral regulation of the money markets rather than the reverse. Both the Europeans and the Saudis strongly favored recycling oil windfalls through the IMF rather than through the private money markets. It was the US that insisted that the euro markets should be the principal mechanism of exchange, thereby confirming the future course of financial globalization. Over the long term, financial globalization shaped both the Cold War and US relations with the world economy in ways that could not have been easily predicted at the outset of the 1970s. By the end of the decade, Eastern Europe had become dependent on international borrowing to sustain its consumer-led growth strategies. The explosions of popular discontent in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Poland in 1970 might have been repressed directly by Soviet force, but the new Communist Party leaders decided that they must allow greater imports and consumption, and a wave of indebtedness to the West, along with greater subsidies from Moscow to sustain cheap oil, began. This financial entwinement between East and West crucially shaped the Cold War's endgame by forcing communist governments to think long and hard about the likely responses of Western investors should they resort to violent repression against domestic dissidents. At the same time, the United States was itself able to draw on globalizing capital markets to sustain its high levels of military spending in such a way as to continue to maintain its global military presence without intruding on levels of domestic consumption. The United States, in this new era of globalization, did not project financial power outwards as the British Empire had done in the 19th century. On the contrary, America's dependence on the transnational money markets ensured that U.S. primacy in the world would increasingly reside atop an empire of debt. And now for my final theme, ideas. From the 1960s, a set of ideas about human rights intruded on the structure of Cold War politics in ways that were remarkably similar to the impact of global finance. These similarities had to do first with the transnational nature of the processes, both of which involve non-state actors and flows across borders, and second, with the basic reality that both financial globalization and the politics of human rights challenged the autonomy of national governments within their sovereign territorial space. Tension between sovereignty and human rights was part of the post-war order virtually from its inception. But for the United States, these tensions were quickly complicated by the advent of the Cold War. The United States did intervene repeatedly in the internal affairs of developing nations during the early phase of the High Cold War. But as even critical historians like Arani Westet now conclude, such interventions were undertaken primarily to thwart Soviet power. It was not that Americans lacked a universalizing impulse, but rather that in the context of the Cold War, the United States had organized its security structure as an alliance of sovereign nations, the integrity of which Washington was reluctant to violate except in extreme circumstance. In consequence, official attitudes towards the human rights issue were conditioned by a preference for national sovereignty over universal idealism. But if the Society of Nation-States cleaved tightly to the principle of sovereign inviolability, in a parallel realm of world affairs, the stock of universal rights was rising during the 1960s. To see this, we must return to Maslach's and Erie's global realm of non-state forces and actors. Within this realm, the 1960s was a critical threshold for human rights, a period of optimism and of activism. The signal human rights organization at this time was Amnesty International. Founded in 1961, Amnesty grew in stature during the decade as it lobbied governments on behalf of prisoners of conscience. Its campaign sought to curtail the authority of governments in the name of universal rights. Other groups pursued similar agendas. At the same time, the issue's rising prominence was reflected in the pages of law journals, in the American Bar Association's decision to endorse the Genocide Convention. By the end of the 1960s, the politics of human rights were unabashedly globalizing. Born on the activism of a flourishing NGO movement, the ideology of human rights contested government's jurisdiction over both space and subjects. During the 1960s, human rights would draw in a broad range of public figures in the United States, a range which included liberal idealists like Donald Fraser, the issue's champion in the House of Representatives. Such hard-nosed enemies of authoritarianism as Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Senator Henry Jackson were among the issue's champions. And it was an issue that also brought in more ideological globalizers, advocates of a kind of integrative transformation of international politics, such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and the legal theorist Richard Falk. One of the central arguments that I develop in my research is that this globalization of human rights decisively affected the exercise of U.S. power in the world. It was not coincidental that a burgeoning concern for human rights coincided with the Nixon-Kissinger era in American foreign policy. Indeed, this administration ignored human rights in ways that the issue's advocates found both infuriating and hypocritical. What was especially frustrating was that Nixon and Kissinger were willing to disregard Soviet human rights abuses in the name of détente, even as they were going about enlisting authoritarian allies in the developing world in the name of an anti-Soviet alliance. Critics thus argued that the administration was guilty of collaboration in maintaining a police state on the one hand, and of being the special friend and protector of tyrannical regimes on the other. But for Kissinger, this was not so much an issue about ideology as it was a basic structural condition of international politics. What I believe, he said, is that there are certain national interests of the United States which transcend the domestic structure of the countries involved. By comparison with this, human rights were, in his words, just sentimental nonsense. But Kissinger did not understand that this globalizing ideology of human rights was rapidly transforming the politics of foreign policy choice. The mid-1970s was a decisive phase for human rights in the United States, a development that was especially clear in congressional activism. Thanks to the opening of archives, I have been able to trace this development through the original documents in which State Department planners struggled to devise a workable human rights policy in response to external pressures. What made human rights so difficult to contend with as a foreign policy issue was the universal scope of its ideological claims. The real problem, as rights advocates saw it, was the international system itself, not any single abusive sovereign. What the human rights movement sought to do was to resolve the conflict between bounded sovereignty and universal human rights, a conflict that had been inherent within the post-war order from its inception in favor of universal rights. One instrument for achieving this, as many NGOs recognized, was to be United States foreign policy. By working with the Congress to impose conditions on recipients of American aid, and by emphasizing the issue in bilateral relationships, the proponents of human rights on both the left and the right sought to transform the international system through the superpower. They were thus part of a globalizing process that soon exercised a decisive impact on the Cold War itself. In the short term, the globalization of human rights had a tangible impact on both superpower relations and on America's alliances in the developing world. Under pressure from European allies and internal critics, Kissinger and Ford agreed to include a set of human rights provisions within the Helsinki Accord of 1975. Over the next years, these human rights clauses would develop an independent significance far transcending that agreement's original geopolitical purpose. The credit for this transformation of Helsinki from geopolitical truce into human rights accord must go primarily to those Russian and East European dissidents who mobilized its human rights clauses against their own oppressive governments. But the United States would become an important supporter of this dissident movement, a source of funds, and a public stage for critics of the Soviet regime. The Congress was thus at the fore of the human rights mobilization of the 1970s. More cautious diplomats worried that both idealists and neoconservatives were wrecking détente, were wrecking America's alliances over a relatively minor issue. Concern for human rights, it is important to understand, did not intrude more on the structure of Cold War alliances than it did on the process of détente itself. Indeed, Kissinger lamented that the advocates of human rights were both disrupting the process of Soviet-American stabilization as they were wrecking America's strategy of containment in the Third World. By the end of his tenure at the State Department, Kissinger was reduced to merely apologizing to the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet that Congress had simply cut the appropriations package for Chile, and as Secretary of State there was very little that he could do about it. Kissinger lamented as he was leaving office that the advocates of human rights were in the process of undermining national security in the name of human rights. Kissinger might have seen human rights as a corrosive force, but during the 70s, ideas about basic human freedoms developed into a new ideological platform for American leadership in the world, one quite distinctive from the ideology of anti-communist containment. that the United States could emerge from the Nixon-Kissinger era as a plausible champion of individual liberties was, in many respects, serendipitous. The Republic's own civil rights transformation during the 1960s made it a much more credible champion of transnational human rights. It also helped that key American allies, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, experienced liberalizing changes during the 70s at the same time as Brezhnev was simultaneously tightening the screws in Eastern Europe. But what was most significant about human rights as an ideological source of American ascendancy was that the doctrine transcended partisan divisions. Liberal and neoconservative proponents of human rights might have disagreed on whether to emphasize the iniquities of right or left-wing dictatorships, but what was more fundamental than this was their concurrence on the universal rights of individuals against the sovereign claims of governments. Indeed, Pat Moynihan, now ambassador to the United Nations, proposed in 1975 that human rights should be the new foundation for American leadership in a post-Cold War world, that human rights should displace the tough pragmatism that had prevailed during the era of the High Cold War. Although this outlook was at odds with Kissinger's philosophy of statecraft, the transformation of international politics was pushing the cause of universal human rights to the fore. But what were the sources of this ideological mobilization? In my work, I argue that the human rights movement of the 1970s reflected the power of transnational ideas in an age of globalization. Concern for human rights was a product of the public's exposure to overseas events in an age of cable television and satellite relays. Indeed, the impact of media coverage on public attitudes about the Vietnam War is well understood. But what has not always been so clear is the breadth of television's impact on public ideas about international affairs during this time. Around the same time as Vietnam, for example, television coverage of starving African infants in the Nigerian Civil War fueled a grassroots campaign that pushed the White House to deliver assistance to illegal NGOs that were carrying aid to the breakaway Republic of Biafra in defiance of the federal government of Nigeria's wishes. Over time, this rising profile of human rights would become an increasingly important concern in domestic politics. In 1976, discord over the moral consequences of Kissinger's diplomacy became a fairly significant electoral issue. The Secretary of State acknowledged this himself, making apologetic reference to human rights in almost 40% of the public addresses that he delivered in that election year. But even this was not enough to mollify public opinion. Indeed, close analysis of election polls suggests that the public's mistrust of Kissinger might have cost Ford dearly in the election. Indeed, Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, quickly established human rights at the centerpiece of his diplomacy. This is often seen as the birth of an authentic human rights foreign policy, but it should more properly be seen as the culmination of over a decade's heightened concern with human rights in both transnational civil society and in American political life. In the attention that he paid to both human rights and to economic interdependence, Jimmy Carter constructed a foreign policy for a post-Cold War world. The first president since Roosevelt not to see the Cold War as his central foreign policy dilemma, Carter's agenda attests to the transformative impact of incipient globalization in the 1970s. It was Carter's misfortune, however, that the advent of a new type of globalization coincided with a still enduring Cold War. The forces of globalization changed the Cold War in important ways, some of which I hope I have just outlined, but the Soviet Empire remained a very real adversary. From the late 1970s, two developments brought East-West tensions back to the fore. First, the Soviet Union's development of a new advanced medium-range missile, the SS-20, devastated the nuclear equilibrium that had existed since the late 1960s. Second, Russia invaded Afghanistan in 1979, a move that Carter interpreted as an offensive thrust against the global against the global energy economy. With strategic equilibrium interrupted and the global economy under threat, a new phase of intense Cold War began. With the perspective of hindsight, however, we should see the 1970s not just as an interregnum between two Cold Wars, but rather as the threshold of a new world order, one that would be dominated by processes of globalization and transnational integration. That this happened within the bounded world of the Cold War was not so ironic as it might seem. After all, the advent of nuclear weapons had already eroded the most fundamental attribute of territorial sovereignty, namely the capacity for self-defense. From the late 1960s, a new type of globalization began to transform the world in ways that would ultimately contribute towards the ending of Cold War divisions. Insofar as this new phase of globalization intensified transnational flows, it was reminiscent of earlier phases of economic integration, particularly that which had occurred in the 19th century under the Pax Britannica. But in other respects, the globalization of the 1970s was different. It accentuated the power and the influence of non-state actors, and, as we have seen, it began to decouple international power from the control of territory. In the short term, to return to our point of departure, globalization contributed to an apparent decline of American power in the world. Financial globalization provoked a major dollar crisis, whilst human rights subverted the statecraft of Cold War containment. But as I have suggested, over the longer term, these processes also contributed to a resurgence in American influence as the United States recast its role in the world to become both chief arbiter and chief beneficiary of globalization. By taking these themes together, the erosion of strategic power, the integration of the international economy, and the diplomacy of human rights, the 70s appear, I hope, not as a lacunae, but as the site of decisive transformations with critical implications for both the Cold War world and beyond.
Thank you, Daniel. There's a lot to chew on there, so why don't we just open it up straight to questions, and if you could identify yourself as well as Daniel knows who.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay.
I want to ask two very different questions.
Okay.
Fair to use the prerogative here. I was very interested in your very last observation, which is that the United States made the pivot to then actually sort of seizing the mantle of globalization and restore its leadership. You said a lot about it in terms of human rights, the Cartership, but I'm curious as to what you would point to on the economic side. And what was the inflection point on the economic side? After all, what Nixon did was not kind of an affirmative strategy. It was a reaction to a lot of forces that they were out of control. At what point do you see that U.S. global economic strategy sort of embraced the idea of globalization, markets, et cetera, beyond what you said about Schultz? So that's one on the economic side. The second on the security side is you said that the Nixon's decision to go off the gold standard precipitated a crisis that had implications for the alliance and for cohesion in the alliance. For students of Asia and the Shakaroo, I mean, one can sort of see that in Japan. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thinking about that. After all, in the 60s, we had the balance of payments crisis. In the early 60s, we had the Alizé Treaty, which is sort of a different direction. The Franco-German relations going off from NATO. Certainly had the French decision to pull out of the Unified Command. What significant different happened that would lead you to think that the alliance was more or less cohesive? I think you had a nice formula about how you described the way that you felt the NATO states were doing. And you had your Europe in '73 related to what you said about the Nixon doctrine, but what was different in kind about the post-Bretton Woods that would lead you to say that there was a looser alliance post-'73 than it was prior to that?
Okay, sure. Those are two really great questions, and it could take me the rest of our time to answer them, so I'll try to do it as succinctly as possible. Your first question, I mean, clearly I think these are two very different processes that I'm describing. The incorporation of human rights within American grand strategy is in many respects much easier than the incorporation of global economic openness. I can point to individuals like Moynihan who saw human rights as a useful strategy to use against the Soviet Union very early on. The narrative of economic globalization does not really run exactly parallel to that. The breakdown of Bretton Woods, the emergence of a more open, integrated financial economy is a far more haphazard process. So I don't think that there is any kind of grand architectural design underlying it. Rather, I see it as a response to choices badly made early on in the Nixon administration's tenure. That said, I do think that there are individuals that one could point to who do have a more clear-headed conception of the United States' future as a dominant force within a more globalized financial economy. In the United States government, I think George Shultz is the preeminent example. If I was to point to any single individual who I would describe as the father of economic globalization, it would probably be Shultz. Outside of government, there are a handful of individuals in the banking community who really do seize onto the notion that open markets have something to offer the United States and American bankers in particular. Walt Wriston is really the preeminent example. But what's interesting about this breakdown of Bretton Woods, I think, is quite how unanticipated and unwelcome it is to many members of the financial community. It's really quite late in the game that most New York bankers come to accept floating exchange rates as an acceptable alternative. For many, it means the disruption of their stable business environment. So there's not such a clear-headed notion, I think, of how open financial markets can contribute to a kind of long-term recasting of American ascendancy within government or even within the private financial community. By the mid-1970s, however, I think that I would point to the Trilateral Commission, to Brzezinski's work in that regard, as illustrative of a new type of intellectual engagement with the challenges of interdependence, of an outlook that suggests, well, look, the U.S. might be more vulnerable to the external world. We can't go it alone, as we did during the 50s and the 60s, in effect. But that by coordinating policy choices with foreign governments, the United States can sustain or restore high levels of growth. This may be conducive to the post-industrial transformations by broadening the scope of economic activity. So I think, fairly early on, there is an engagement with some of the potential of this transformative moment. The notion, and what I talk about more directly in my talk, is the way in which globalizing financial markets become a resource for Reagan's arms buildup. Certainly, it's very convenient for the Reagan administration that financial markets allow Washington to borrow, in a sense, without driving up domestic interest rates to the level at which they would have really slowed down domestic growth. That's certainly not anticipated at this stage. There's no realization that global financial markets could have a kind of military application in the Cold War. To come to your second question on the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the fragmentation of the Western Alliance, I mean, that's a really good question, because the Western Alliance certainly does look much more fractious in the 1960s than I was able to show in this short presentation. I think in respects, 73 is an important turning point, because with the breakdown of Bretton Woods, we do see a move towards the consolidation of the European economic community, as it was then, towards its internal economic unity, autonomous from the United States. So insofar as this early 1970s pivot sees a transition from a more unified Western world economy towards one that may be organized more around trilateral poles, sort of a world of regions, as it's been described recently, I think that it is an important pivot, though certainly I wouldn't say that the diplomacy of the early 1970s within the alliance is so much more cantankerous than it had been in the 60s.
I mean, after all, it was 73 that the European monetary unification broke apart too. So in some respects, if you look at the trajectory of European integration, this is not it wasn't a high water mark on that side either. I mean, they're related, but it was the Euro optimists were not in ascendancy at that point either.
No, I think prevailing economic conditions make it difficult to work, but if you look at the political will that exists within Europe, the experimentation with the snake in the tunnel, that in a world of floating currencies, the Europeans would tether their currencies together in a fixed matrix, though it doesn't endure, which has to do with global economic conditions, it does signify a real political willingness to develop a new type of European economic autonomy within a more globalized financial arena. Of course, the oil crisis transforms the conditions of the broader world economy and makes this really quite difficult to sustain.
Let me the stipulated agreement with most of your, what you said about the 70s. What's troubling me a little bit about the presentation, though, is that this decadal time frame is rather arbitrary.
Yeah.
And you seem to be presenting the 70s as being the moment in which an architecture of a post-high Cold War financial and global environment came into being.
Sure.
But if you just drag you a little bit over the edge of your time frame and into the 80s, you have dramatic changes which threaten the viability of that system. I just want you to get your comments on two of them. One is the debt crisis, which is arguably at the foundation of the collapse of the development project in Africa and Latin America, and basically what we're seeing now in Latin America, a substantial rebellion against globalization doctrine. And secondly, beginning in 1979, the opening of China, and ultimately the rise of China into its present position as the U.S.'s perhaps not largest, but certainly politically most significant creditor. And something which seems to me cuts at the other piece of your analysis, which is the linkage between financial globalization and human rights. After one has no leverage over Chinese human rights policy. Basically, we've seen the abandonment of human rights as a strategy, at least in that respect. So I'm wondering if you can get your comments on those two issues. How do you see things?
Sure. No, those are great questions, and I share many of your concerns about the difficulties of periodizing these globalizing changes, and as you can see from the dates that I presented at the beginning of the talk, my 1970s stretches from 1968 until 1980, so it's not strictly, it doesn't perfectly tessellate with the calendar on that point. And to address your question directly, I would argue that what I'm describing in the 1970s has more to do with the breakdown of the post-Cold War, with the post-war system of international relations, that which I characterize as the period of the high Cold War, and that the construction of the architecture of globalization, it does begin during this period, and there are important changes, but I certainly would not see the process as complete by 1980. Rather, I think by shifting the periodization of post-war history to think about globalization as a process that really begins to take shape in new ways from the 70s with the breakdown of an old order, rather than as a process that begins in 1989 with the collapse of the Cold War, we can get at a more accurate historical rendering of modern globalization as a historical process. So I certainly don't want to imply that I would see this process as finalized or complete in any way by 1980. It's rather the way in which it...
I want to press you on what happened in 1981-82.
So let me... Great. Let me come to the debt crisis, and I think that does illustrate what I see as the consequences of changes during the 1970s as being enduring into the 80s. And the debt crisis, so far as I see it, we trace it back to the oil crisis, and that's where it all begins. I think what the debt crisis shows is some of the limitations of George Shultz's vision of open capital markets, that in a world that remains divided into sovereign states. Here we do deal very directly with some of the tensions between sovereign prerogatives, namely the prerogative to repudiate debt, and transnational money flows, that in a world in which sovereign states remain the basic repository of legitimate violence, transnational transnational financial intermediaries do not always have means of recourse when lending to sovereign governments. So it's a really good example of the way in which this transformation of the world from a world which is dominated by powerful nation states in the 50s and 60s into a world in which global actors and forces become more influential, more powerful from the 70s. That issue, I think, shows how very partial that transformation is, and how these two concepts of international history, the global and the geopolitical, continue to interrelate in quite striking ways. Your second point about the China opening, it's a really, very, very important part of the changes that occur during the 70s. I deal with Nixon's opening of China primarily as a geostrategic maneuver, which I think is exactly how he saw it. I agree absolutely. By the end of the 1970s, China is becoming integrated into the Western world economy. It's no longer simply a useful strategic lever to use against the Soviet Union, but rather has set out on the path towards becoming an essential part of the globalizing world economy. Why that happens, I think it has more to do with Chinese decisions and preferences than it does with any coherent American design. Insofar as it relates to the human rights issue, there's very little enthusiasm, even in the Carter administration, for introducing human rights to Sino-American relations. China remains, in this period, perhaps the preeminent example of a powerful territorial state that will accept intrusions on its territorial sovereignty only when it's concerned that those meet its own conception of its national interests. So China remains, I think, much more immune to many of these globalizing forces that I've outlined than do most other nation states in the world at this time. Okay.
My question is somewhat in the same vein as Professor Galbraith's,
okay,
in the sense of trying to go a little bit over the edge of your time period, because I think it's actually necessary to test this claim.
Sure.
The most controversial claim I heard was that the globalization of human rights, quote, subverted the statecraft of Cold War confusion. That's a very significant claim, and you purport to, what social scientists would say, test that in the period of 1965 to 80, and the one piece of data that you cite is the fact that Kissinger could not continue aid to Pinochet because Congress was cracking down on human rights in the mid to late 1970s. But I would submit that the real test of your claim comes immediately afterwards, when Ronald Reagan comes to office in 1981, and in those early 1980s. And if you actually trace the history there, which historians do, it's a little different story than you tell. The first thing Reagan does is he nominates an assistant secretary for human rights who says that his goal is to eliminate the assistant secretary for human rights. So you can hardly claim that at that point there's some sort of universalization of human rights. The president appoints someone who says we should not have human rights as part of our foreign policy.
No.
Now, Congress doesn't like that because Congress was created the office. So Reagan then has to appoint somebody else. So who does he appoint? Elliott Abrams. Okay? And also puts Jim Kirkpatrick in the administration. And what's their policy? Their policy is that we should use human rights as a stick to beat up the Soviets, but we should give a pass to all of the right wing of users of human rights and all of those who want to overthrow Congress. So we give aid to Savimbi in Angola. We give aid to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. We give aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. We give aid to radical Islamists in Afghanistan. We support an authoritarian government in the Philippines. So if that's what we're doing, we're helping all of the human rights abusers we like, and we're using human rights only as a stick against the communists, then how can we possibly say that human rights subverted the statecraft of Cold War containment?
Well, had I included the adverb successfully in there, then my claim would certainly be open to exposure. Look, I agree with everything that you've said. I think that we see the Reagan administration as successfully ratcheting back the influence of human rights on foreign policy, by several notches. But what I'm trying to do, I think, is to see this narrative of human rights as an issue in United States foreign policy, as an issue history which has a fairly long antecedents going back to the 70s, which is when this issue, really begins to intrude upon congressional politics, when it really becomes a factor in executive branch policy making. I don't want to argue that this transforms every bilateral relationship which the United States has with the foreign government. Of course it doesn't. But it's a new factor that wasn't really there in the 1950s. It wasn't really there in the early 1960s. It's new and original in the 70s, and it changes the story in important and decisive ways. That the Reagan administration successfully modifies Carter's notion of human rights as a more universal factor in foreign policy, the Kirkpatrick doctrine, whereby human rights is applied exclusively to left-wing violators and authoritarians of the right get a free pass, I think attests to the fact that human rights has already become part of the picture by the 1970s. In a sense, without Donald Fraser, without Amnesty International, it's difficult to know how we would have got to Kirkpatrick. So, I don't want to make a value-based judgment about any of this at this point. What I'm simply arguing is that to think about human rights as a factor in history, to establish that as a narrative within the long-term processes of American foreign policy, we have to see Reagan, we have to see Kirkpatrick as coming out of this globalizing moment of the 1970s. And there's a new book on Reagan by John Diggins that says that Reagan's attitude on human rights, his outlook on the world, was largely because of his Emersonian political philosophy, that he saw people as basically good. And I have problems with that way of looking at the Reagan administration, with seeing Reagan as the inventor of the end of the Cold War. What I'm arguing is that there are many changes that happen in the 1970s which transform both the ideological and the material basis of America's situation in the world, which ultimately facilitate Ronald Reagan, which facilitate Reagan's efforts to end the Cold War in his terms. And of course he does that in ways that many of the more idealistic advocates of human rights in the 70s would have found quite reprehensible. I'm sure that Donald Fraser would have, he did condemn the Kirkpatrick doctrine. That said, Daniel Patrick Moynihan is not so skeptical. So, I think there are important continuities as well as discontinuities, but without the 70s, it's very difficult to get to the 1980s and to get to Reagan's broader human rights policy.
Actually,
Sure.
I would like to ask you a question.
Sure.
I was fascinated in your chart about the periodization, and historians are always this is something they struggle with, when periods begin, when they end, how to identify them. And in the policy community, the Cold War is still essentially seen as more or less this monolithic period that exists from either 45 or 47 to 89 to 91. And as you know, as Mark knows, there's been a lot of questioning and doubting about that in the historical community. My sort of thought about this before seeing this chart there had been this period 49 to 63, the intense Cold War, there's a stabilization in Europe, and there's sort of, after 63, things get a lot less dangerous. There's sort of Cold War II, late 70s, early 80s, not as scary, but sort of there was kind of a rhythm to it. The real implication, I think, of this chart, if I was to push you, is that in many ways the Cold War ends with Helsinki and with SALT and the end of Bretton Woods. And I kind of want to push you on saying post-Cold War. I mean, are you saying the Cold War is over? And I think one of the things you didn't bring up in your talk I'd be very interested to hear about, which I think argues for this, is the focus you have from strategic focus to East Asia, to Western Europe, to the Middle East, and the global commons. And one of the things, particularly in the Middle East, which is clearly the focus today of much of our strategic consideration, a lot of those problems emerged during this period. And one of the difficulties for historians trying to figure out the origins of these things is to figure out how much of it has Cold War roots and how much of this Islamic fundamentalism, the sort of various interregional disputes, the difficulties with Israel, how much of those were creations of the Cold War, and this is just kind of a leftover from the Cold War, and how much of these problems were unique, had nothing to do or little to do with the Cold War, had their origins in the 60s and 70s in the period you're dealing with, and how we look at them now. Because if we're to study and understand, say, U.S. relations with Iran, or our relationship with Saudi Arabia, or our policies in the Middle East, what does your work and your periodization say about how we should look at that? Are these Cold War issues, not Cold War issues? And then if you make a general comment about it, are you actually saying that the Cold War, if you say post-Cold War, that it more or less ends with these major transformational changes we talked about?
Sure, those are some great questions, and I'm glad that you've given me the opportunity to clarify some of the really difficult issues in this. Let me start by making a few remarks on this question of periodization. I'm concerned that often as historians we periodize blocks of time monochromatically. We would see the entire 1945 to 89 period as the Cold War. And I don't want to argue that the Cold War ceased to be a factor after the mid-1970s, but rather that we should be able to conceive of parallel narratives of periodization, that we can conceive of the Cold War and of globalization as overlapping, as having a simultaneous existence. I think it's an overly simplistic view of periodization, which would suggest that we move from one era into the next, and that characteristics and facets of the earlier era do not persevere and do not continue. So I don't want to argue that the Cold War necessarily ends or is utterly terminated by the mid-1970s, but rather that we see this new era of globalization begin to take shape. That's why, perhaps a little literary license, I describe the phase that begins in the 1970s as a post-Cold War era. I use that phase quite deliberately. I appreciate that it can be controversial, but I use it because I want to emphasize the continuities between this era that takes shape in the 1970s and what we habitually think of as the post-Cold War era of the 1990s. So by arguing for continuity across the fall of the wall, I hope that I construct enough space to partially justify that label of a post-Cold War era. To come back to the major part of your question, which is to what extent can we see some of these crises which have to do with the reorientation of American strategy towards the Middle East in the 70s as Cold War or post-Cold War crises. I think that they're both. And what's very interesting to look at the Middle East crisis of the early 70s, which is something that I've written on in my dissertation, it's a crisis which in its material sources is a post-Cold War crisis. It's a crisis of globalization. America's embroilment in the Middle East, it has to, we can just walk out to I-35 and there's the explanation for why the United States becomes more embroiled in that region. And this all happens in the early 1970s. It's in 1970 that domestic production reaches peak oil and begins to retreat. After this point, the United States becomes a net oil importer by 1978. It's this globalization of the energy economy that makes the United States inextricably interdependent on the resources of the Middle East that underlies the strategic reorientation. At the same time, there is a quite conscious realignment of forces by the United States government from Southeast Asia to the Middle East during the 1970s. The Nixon doctrine, and there's one wonderful transcript in which Kissinger is talking with a colleague in the National Security Council, in which he says, well, the Nixon doctrine is just a conceit to get the hell out of Vietnam and the hell into the Middle East. And there's a certain truth to that. The alliances which are forged with Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are the preeminent examples of the Nixon doctrine in the Middle East, do come out of Cold War considerations. The notion underlying those strategic relationships is that by encouraging Iran and Saudi Arabia to develop into pillars of regional defense, that the United States can maintain an anti-Soviet front in the Middle East at a low cost. At the same time, it's only the oil crisis, the globalization of financial markets, which makes Iran and Saudi Arabia able to afford large purchases of American military hardware. So these relationships are both relationships born of globalization and born of the Cold War. I think they attest to the very difficulties of trying to extricate these historical narratives at this point in time.
Sure. I was much struck by your analysis, but there are parts of it that baffle me. Why, when you talk about ideas, you talk solely about human rights in the 70s? To me, the issues of energy, words I don't believe you ever used, dominated the American discourse. Yes, you did talk about yellow shocks, but energy independence, a set of related concepts, still dominated a great deal of congressional and public discourse. Also, you seem to have, you personalize, you have your hero, or you have, I guess, Fraser, maybe Brzezinski, you'll tell us why. You certainly have your villain, Henry Kissinger. By the way, I don't think that Kissinger cost for many votes in 1976. I think there are other factors that changed the discourse, including Ford's own ineptitude.
Sure.
Arena. But, well, it seems to me that you'd be better off if you talk in the third category, in that particular slide, more ideas than simply human rights. It was an essential preamble to globalization, but it struck me that just as you were eclectic in defining the ideas of Sargent, Keynes was important, he was not alone. There are other voices. Would you both criticize and then deify at one hand, which I'll be interested in the transition. But I think you need to have a somewhat broader concept of theory in the 70s to bring their basic hypothesis, which is very interesting to me.
No, that's a great comment, and I'm grateful to you for allowing me to sort of broaden that definition at this point in the talk. You know, for the purposes of this presentation, I certainly chose to emphasize the human rights narrative because I felt that it gave me a way to address what I set up as my central question, which was the erosion of the strategy of containment during the 70s. But it's in my broader dissertation, I'm very concerned to develop a much broader concept of the types of ideas that are transforming the international system. The broadest umbrella under which I would encompass those ideas would be the very notion of interdependence, that the United States can no longer be so isolated from the world and has become utterly dependent on the rest of the world for both its material and economic security. And among those themes, I think energy is preeminent in its importance. I agree that it absolutely dominates the public debate, and it's something that I do get into much more fully in the written text. To come back to your point about heroes and villains, I had a chart, which, if I can get this thing to work again, which made some interesting points on the 76 election, because I agree that Kissinger is not a, I don't know where it is. I'm sorry, these are some supplementary images that I had. But what's interesting about the 76 election is you're absolutely right that Kissinger is not a major factor, except for a small group of voters. Here it is, I'm sorry. What's key here, this is an analysis that I did on opinion polls that came out of the 76 election. And this essentially shows how voters feel about Henry Kissinger. And I looked at this with a friend who knows more about this kind of analysis than I do. And it's this group of voters here, the 9% of voters who have absolute disdain for Kissinger, who are really very interesting if we want to understand the importance of feelings about Henry Kissinger in that election, because there's a very, very strong correlation between those voters' feelings about Kissinger, regardless of their party registration, and their choices to vote against Ford in the 76 election. So though not a large number of voters, we're dealing with less than 10%, but the strength of feeling that these people have about Kissinger does sway people's voter choices. So although, you know, I think Kissinger was, in many respects, a very competent Secretary of State, and I'm anxious not to demonize Kissinger. I don't want to take the Christopher Hitchens view of Kissinger as unmitigated villain. Rather, you know, I think my view is ultimately more sympathetic, even more tragic. I would see Kissinger as a figure whose concept of statecraft is being, you know, rendered increasingly redundant simply by the transformation of the international system itself. And in many ways, Kissinger is the most effective practitioner of Cold War containment during the entire Cold War. He's quite visionary in his tactical brilliance. What I see in the 70s is that the world is changing in ways that expose Kissinger to a range of accusations, to a range of criticisms that simply did not face his predecessors of a generation earlier.
I was with both Kissinger and Schultz in the same room 2 weeks ago. I knew they were talking to one another. Like you, I would like to have heard exactly what they said.
Yes. No, that would be fascinating.
So you, in your talk, you took a huge point. You're trying to explain tectonic shifts in lots of things. When you're trying to do that, obviously you skim over a lot of details and you can't consider too many alternatives because you're trying to lay out a lot of material. In the big swing vein, you're trying to explain the end of the Cold War and to date it to sometime in the 70s.
Sure.
This was Frank's point. I'm having trouble accepting this big swing because it strikes me that the Cold War had a winner and a loser. It wasn't something that just ended. And in the 1970s, it looks like the winner's the other guys. It's not the trajectory of where things are going in the 70s is nowhere near where it ended up. I could pose two alternative definitions of the end of the Cold War. One is that when the U.S. got a secure second strike nuclear capability in the 1960s, we were done. right? The Cold War continued because for some reason we still cared about Europe. And in the 70s, we were losing Europe, right? But then somehow in the late 70s and the early 80s, there was, coming out of Vietnam, there was a renewed commitment to investing in conventional military technologies, the two-track decision on nuclear issues in Europe. There was a set of things that we did that really, so, you know, some of the investments got made in the 70s, but they came to fruition. Like where the Cold War was fundamentally changed in the 1980s, right? And so you can try the 1983 statement by Marshall Agarkov that we can't keep up with the revolution in military affairs, the new technologies the U.S. is deploying militarily, something like that. That, you know, if I was trying to pick a point where the Cold War turned against the Soviets, I just wouldn't find it in the 70s. I guess once you get past the Cold War just ending, I guess I'd like you to defend your choice to think the Cold War ended, and that was what mattered, as opposed to victory and defeat in the Cold War. And then, or tell me why we won the Cold War in the 70s, why we were winning in 1976.
Well, you know, the reasons you have to, at the time, you would have had to probe very deep. You know, some people did, but no, but it's hard to see on the surface in the 1970s that the Cold War is going in a way that's favorable to the United States. I mean, after all, the Soviet Union has embarked upon its blue water naval policy from the late 1960s. It now has a global military reach. The third world seems to be going their way, not our way. In what respects do the signs appear favorable to American power over the long term in the Cold War? I mean, one answer would be to look at the oil crisis and the impact that this has on the Soviet Union. And certainly the oil crisis in the short term is very bad news for the West. The 73 oil shocks pushed the price of oil up by around 400%. This is very good news for the Soviet Union. What it does is it gives the Soviet Union all kinds of trade advantages vis-a-vis its East European Comecon partners. The Soviet Union is a major exporter of oil. It's a beneficiary of some of these changes in the 1970s. I think a consequence of that is that the Soviet Union continues to pursue this strategy of heavy industrial output. You know, it makes bad automobiles and heavy refrigerators, and it does so very poorly. The West, during this period of crisis, embarks upon a kind of post-industrial transformation. It reorients its productive priorities in such a way as to make possible the some of the transformations of the 1980s in the military balance. By shifting investment away from heavy industry, we see a wave of plant closings during the 1970s. We see services, especially information services, education, scientific research and design, become an increasingly important part of the American GDP portfolio. And this is true across the Western world, that this is a crisis for the West in the sense that it's an era of great transformation as well as of upheaval. It's a crisis for the West that does ultimately contribute to the victory in the Cold War or the defeat of the Soviet Union, whichever way you want to look at it. I mean, my inclination is to see the end of the Cold War not in terms of the West's victory, but simply in terms of the Soviet Union running out of steam. But you know, I appreciate there are two ways to look at this, and I don't want to argue heavily for one as opposed to the other. But I think that by the late 1970s, the Soviet Union is unmistakably in a state of deep industrial, social, and economic malaise, and that has to do with its failure to master, you know, these new challenges of globalization and post-industrial production.
Well, Daniel, that was fascinating. There's a lot to chew on, and thank you very much for a great presentation.